Ænima might be the most elusive album of all time. The mysteries to this album went unsolved for 28 years. Until now. This video will reveal all the answers. Major spoilers ahead. Notice how the album title is spelled with an I, but the song is spelled with an E. As you already know, the album title Ænima combines the two words Ænima and Ænima. It is logically two albums in one. The middle track, Intermission, splits the album into two halves. The first half of the album represents Ænima, and the second half represents Ænima. Although there are themes of Carl Jung's psychology concept, the Ænima and animus, throughout the album, the first half of the album actually represents the old pharmacy definition of the word anima, which is the active ingredient of an animal or vegetable drug. This album takes place at the dawn of proto-history, which spans roughly 3000 BC to 600 BC. In the album Undertow, humans discovered fire and were beginning to cook the meat they ate, hence the animal ribs on the album cover. Humanity's sense of time was limited. Humans were just starting to realize the cycles of the seasons and when to expect crops to grow. This is indicated in the last track when he talks about the carrot holocaust. That leads right into the first track on Ænima, Stinkfist. Although Stinkfist is partially about becoming aware of the affect of overstimulation on the human body, on a deeper level, the song is actually about humans experimenting with using manure to fertilize plants. The discovery of manure allowed humans to grow much higher quantities of crops, which led to tribes trading and bartering with other tribes to obtain foods and items they weren't able to get before. The song Hooker with a Penis is about those early stages of trading and bartering. Compared to Undertow, when humans were just learning how to cook meat, in Ænima, humans are now experimenting with melting metals, which led to the crafting of tools and weapons. Notice the bouncing sound at the beginning of Stinkfist. It sounds like humans trying to hammer something with a rock. Then notice the tinking sound at the beginning of Eulogy. It sounds like they're chiseling a stone tablet with a metal nail, perhaps a tombstone. Notice towards the end of the song he says the word nail. Also notice when he says, "No way to recall what it was that you had said to me." This is because humans haven't invented written language yet, but they do later, as described with the track Message to Harry Manback, which is basically a written letter spoken out loud. On the surface, the song H is about women starting to notice the patterns of pregnancy and their menstrual cycles, which is explored more in Mer de Noms when humans started tracking the orbits of the moon and nearby planets. The track Intermission represents both the woman's 9-month pregnancy and the splitting of the album into two acts. Another very interesting lyric is when he says, "Without the skin here, beneath the storm, under these tears now, the walls came down." Firstly, it is referencing the song Cold and Ugly from the album Opiate, when he says, "Underneath the skin and jewelry, hidden in her words and eyes, is a wall that's cold and ugly." When he says the word skin, he's talking about the animal skins that humans used as coats to keep warm in the winter. But in the song H, he's saying without the skin, which indicates that this song takes place in the spring or summertime. The next track, Useful Idiot, which is just the sound of a record player spinning, represents the invention of the wheel. The invention of the wheel led to the invention of the wagon, which allowed humans to travel with bigger quantities of items for trading. The title of the next track, 46 and 2, has multiple meanings, the obvious one being about chromosomes. The second meaning, I believe, is a reference to the 10 and 2 hand position on a steering wheel. If holding a wheelbarrow in front of you, your hands would be roughly in a 46 and 2 hand position, which is why he says, "Contemplate what I've been clinging to, 46 and 2 ahead of me." This further emphasizes the importance of the wagon being invented. Notice in the next album, Salaval, there is a track called Merkaba. Merkaba is the Hebrew word for chariot. Here's the mind blower. The Deftones album White Pony was released just a few months before Salaval, featuring the song with Maynard called Passenger. In that song he says, "Roll the window down, this cool night, air is curious." That line is a reference to the song Eulogy when he says, "So he bashes his skull through the window while looking out to the sea." I'll explain more about the song Passenger another time. The meaning of 46 and 2 referring to human chromosomes is actually describing the character in the next track, Harry Manback. Most people think 46 and 2 are the chromosomes of evolved humans. That is incorrect. It is actually the chromosomes of less evolved humans. Harry Manback is a less evolved human. His name is describing him being similar to a monkey. When Maynard says, "I've been crawling on my belly, clearing out what could have been," it is describing someone trying to figure out why their crops aren't growing. As I will soon explain, it is actually Harry Manback who is having problems with growing crops, which I believe leads to him stealing from others, and then being exiled from the tribe, which is why he's angry in message to Harry Manback. This is the most important line. "See my shadow changing, stretching up and over me, soften this old armor." It is indicating that humans have begun to forge armor and weapons. Some metals melt at temperatures higher than wood fire is capable of. His shadow stretching upward may suggest that he is using a higher temperature fire. Relative to that, the lyric 46 and 2 are just ahead of me is describing the reason he is making the armor, because violent, less civilized people are nearby. The third meaning, when he says, "See my shadow changing, stretching up and over me," this is also describing the discovery of sundials. Humans are just beginning to measure time, as you will see a lot more of in the next album, Salivul. Notice in this song he also says, "Now is my time." The next track, Message to Harry Manback, indicates humans now have written language. The monologue is a written letter being read out loud. Harry Manback is an important character, which is why he makes an obvious reappearance in the next album, Salivul, with the track Message to Harry Manback Part 2. He makes a few other appearances that are not obvious at all, which include Hooker with a Penis, the song Ænima, and The Grudge. Proof of that is the lyric in The Grudge when he says, "Unable to forgive your scarlet lettermen." The clue that Harry Manback is the character who failed to grow crops, in 46 and 2, is in the song Ænima when he says, "I'm praying for rain." Throughout that song, and every track he appears in, Harry Manback always has a very negative outlook. He is actually the one who wears the crown of negativity, as mentioned in The Grudge. Although Ænima and Lateralis take place at least 1,000 years apart, Harry Manback appears on both albums because he's more of an archetype than an actual person. So, given that Harry Manback was exiled from his tribe, indicates that humans are beginning to write laws. This is emphasized again later in the song Ænima, with the Bill Hicks rant about drug laws. In the next track, Hooker with a Penis, Harry Manback is actually the antagonist that this character is speaking of. Harry Manback has been trying to convince the people of the tribe, which he was just exiled from, to turn against their leader and follow him instead. But this character is basically rejecting Harry's ideas and judgments. It's actually very interesting when Maynard says, "Before you point your finger, you should know that I'm the man," because humans didn't have names yet. They just pointed at each other to get their attention. According to the internet, humans started naming each other somewhere around the year 3200 BC, which is why the very next song after the intermission track is called Jimmy. Jimmy is obviously a simple name, but the names evolve and have more meaning later on in Mère de Noms, such as Thomas, Brenna, Rose, and Judith. This is also why that album title translates to Sea of Names. When he says, "I sold my soul to make a record," it is emphasizing humanity's new ability to write and keep a history of events. When he says, buy, send more money," it indicates that they are at a swap meet. Also, they actually didn't have money yet. Coins are invented in Lateralis, although the Mère de Noms song Magdalena mentions the use of money when he says, "I'd sell my soul and my self-esteem, $1 at a time." This is because he's not actually using money. It's describing how the need for money to be invented came to be. Obviously, Hooker with a Penis sounds like Maynard is dealing with a judgmental fan. That's just to throw everyone off from realizing what the song is really about. The next track, Intermission, splits the album into 2 separate acts. Intermission is a jump forward in time, about 1,000 years or so, transitioning from proto-history into the Bronze Age. Intermission is also the time passed during pregnancy. In a sense, the woman in the song H is giving birth to Jimmy, even though the 2 songs happen 1,000 years apart, because these characters are more like archetypes that represent all the people of their time who dealing with these issues. So to recap, each song of the first half is primarily about humanity's advances in agriculture. The struggle with farming led to the inventions of the various tools, the wheel, and the wagon. Having a surplus of food led to trading and traveling, which we will see a lot more of in Mer de Noms. Now for the second half. Their use of the word Ænima isn't really about injecting water into your rectum. It's more about how humans were becoming more aware of the need to wash, bathe, and swim. In this time period, humans are beginning to realize that bathing reduces infections and illnesses. They're also realizing the benefits of washing their vegetables and boiling their drinking water. Remember, humans were just starting to melt metal. Before that happened, they didn't have metal pots to boil water in. According to the internet, humans have been swimming for 100,000 years, but it was in this period when humans began swimming for exercise, cleanliness, and communal recreation. In the next album, Salivul, humanity's evolving abilities to craft tools led to the invention of the boat. Notice the album cover has a boat shape behind the human figure. This leads to the traveling of oceans in Mer de Noms. It's obviously also meant to look like wings, indicating how in this time period, humans began imagining new concepts like angels and demons, hence the song title, Die Eier von Satan. This is the very beginning stages of humans creating mythologies and later religions. Okay, now let's start with the first song of the second half, Jimmy. The first line when he says, "What was it like to see the face of your own stability suddenly look away, leaving you with the dead and hopeless?" This is describing how humans are starting to travel more. When humans invented the wagon, they started exploring nearby lands, seeking to trade crops and things with other tribes, including medicines. Rumors typically spread during these trades. Humans would then begin traveling much further in search of herbs and medicines believed might cure their family's illnesses. But many times the daring explorers never returned. 11 is when we waved goodbye. There's several reasons Maynard uses the number 11 here. Firstly, because the tally system was the first form of written language that humans developed. When humans learned to grow surpluses of crops, they began keeping counts of each crop they had. This leads to the second reason. Now that humans developed basic number systems, they started keeping track of their ages. All these things led to humans developing a larger mental capacity for memories. Being able to count years gave them a better frame of reference when telling their stories. Third reason, Maynard uses the number 11 to describe the danger of storms out in the ocean. In the Pucifer song, Man Overboard, he says, "Poseidon's on a mission, bout to turn it up to 11. This indicates that Jimmy is about the very early stages of humans trying to cross the seas on boat. The character who is leaving their family in search of medicine is later found dead, washed up on shore in the last song, Third Eye, when he says, "I stick my hand into the shadow to pull the pieces from the sand, which I attempt to reassemble, to see just who I might have been. I do not recognize the vessel, but the eyes seem so familiar." There is one very misleading line when he says, "Under a dead Ohio sky." They are nowhere near Ohio. The stories so far are likely taking place in Asia, Europe, or Africa. However, that lyric is setting up for a much more elaborate metaphor that continues in the song Numa, because the album Fear Inoculum does take place in America. The line in Numa when he says, "Wake up now, child, wake up, child, release the light," that is a reference back to Jimmy when he says, "I'll come to your light, hold your light where I can see." Maynard uses many tricks to throw people off, suggesting this song is taking place in Ohio, which is where he is from, makes listeners think this song is about his personal life rather than being an epic story about human history. He does this a lot in his songs. He builds in these misleading, low-hanging fruit assumptions to keep listeners from realizing that all his albums are telling the story of human history, because obviously if it was easy to figure out, then it wouldn't be that interesting, and there would be no mystery to it. I'm sure there are elements from Maynard's personal life that he uses as metaphors in his songs, but I am skeptical about his mother being paralyzed for 27 years. I think either the number of years being paralyzed is exaggerated or possibly just made up entirely. Let's think about this. Firstly, the title 10,000 Days is a reference to the planet Saturn. Saturn takes approximately 10,000 days to revolve around the sun, hence the lyric from The Grudge when he says, Saturn comes back around. 10,000 days is roughly 27 years, the amount of time Maynard's mother is said to have been paralyzed. Judith Marie's online obituaries, which all seem to have been written by Tool fans, state that her aneurysm happened in 1976, although no specific date is ever given. Well, if Maynard was born on April 17, 1964, her aneurysm would have had to happen between January 1st and April 17th in order for Maynard to have been 11 when it happened. Remember when I said the song H takes place in the spring or summertime? Well, if you add the 9 months that passed in the track Intermission, the song Jimmy would land roughly in the correct time. For instance, if the song H happened in June, then the song Jimmy would be happening in March. The math seems to work out too conveniently, which makes me think the story about his mother is fabricated, or at least not entirely accurate. However, there's no evidence available to the public to prove it true or false, so it will probably remain a mystery. Okay, next track is Die Eier von Satan. Well, because humans now have written language, and they're trading crops and ideas with other tribes, they're also starting to write recipes and experiment with foods and medicines. Apparently, the recipe is for a psychedelic treat of some sort, so this points back to the definition of Ænima as the active ingredient of an animal or vegetable drug. The use of Satan in the name indicates this is when humans first started to ponder the idea of demons and gods. This concept expands further in the following APC albums, Mère de Noms and 13th Step, as there's many references to the ancient Greek and ancient Egyptian gods. This idea is continued in the following song Ænima, when he says, I'm praying for rain, I'm praying for tidal waves. If it's not obvious, that character is praying to the rain gods. Remember I said, Stinkfist is about humans discovering manure to help crops grow, and Hooker with a penis is about those humans having abundances of crops to sell. Well, Ænima is from the perspective of people whose crops didn't grow, thus they are praying for rain. If you look back at the song Eulogy, that was when humans first began to bury their dead and thinking more about the afterlife, which eventually led to the idea of gods and demons, as indicated with Die Eier von Satan, which leads to the idea of Armageddon as mentioned in the song Ænima, when he says, some say we'll see Armageddon soon. Okay, next song is Push It. This song seems to be the most elusive one. It stumped me for so long until I realized it was actually quite simple. This song is simply about the early phases of learning to swim, or sailing in a boat, or both. After learning what I've explained so far, you can now see how he's describing being inside a boat when he says, I am somewhere I don't want to be. Yeah, push me somewhere I don't want to be. Of course, there's other drama going on in this song, but I'll explain more about this song in another video. The next track, Cesaro Summability, has several purposes. Firstly, it shows how humanity's mathematics at this point have evolved to include concepts such as infinity, and it shows humans' psychological inability to imagine the world continuing without us after we die. This leads to humans obsessing about the end of the world in the next song. Some say the end is near, some say we'll see Armageddon soon. But relative to the scheme of the album's second half, the Ænima half, this track is describing how humans once thought oceans and seas were infinite, but now they are realizing there is land on the other side. This is setting the stage for Mère de Noms. Next is the title track Ænima. I'll just point out the obvious lines. Learn to swim, flush it all down, I'm praying for rain, I'm praying for tidal waves, see you down in Arizona Bay. Now that people were spending a lot more time in the water, they were beginning to realize the importance of bathing, which leads to humans experimenting more with curing and preventing diseases, as you will see more of in songs on Lateralis and 13th Step. When he says, one great big festering neon distraction, this points to the future track Eon Blue Apocalypse on Lateralis. At this point, humans haven't discovered yet that the moon and nearby planets are causing tidal waves, which is what caused the person to drown and die, in the song Jimmy. In the next album, Mère de Noms, we'll see humanity's early attempts to track planets and chart the seas. I think the general negative attitude of this song is actually from the perspective of Harry Manback. Remember, he is less evolved, so the lyric "I'm praying for rain" indicates that he's having trouble growing crops. I think this gives his new tribe a reason to invade the old tribe that exiled him, to steal their food, which leads to their quarrels in the song The Grudge. The next track, Ions, obviously sounds like a storm is brewing. This would make the character in the previous song believe that their prayers for rain actually worked. This describes how the concept of gods were originally created, out of desperation and selective attention. The mythological god was likely a rain god. More gods are later created in Mer de Noms, Lateralis, and 13th Step. The mathematical negative sign between the parenthesis in the track title is actually the crown of negativity mentioned in The Grudge. And who was just crowned? You guessed it, Harry Manback. The mathematical crown symbol also has something to do with the APC logo, but to hear more about that you'll have to subscribe and watch my later video on Mer de Noms. Finally, the last song, Third Eye. The Bill Hicks monologue represents Harry Manback. Just like in Hooker with a Penis, he's giving his anti-authority views, trying to recruit followers by turning the people against their current leader. Remember earlier when I said the track Message to Harry Manback was showing how humans were just beginning to create laws? It has all come full circle now, when Bill Hicks says, "It's not a war on drugs, it's a war on personal freedom." The repeated whisper, in, out, followed by him saying, "A child's rhyme stuck in my head." I think this is describing the earliest attempts of tribes trying to form armies. The previous track, Ions, sounded like a storm brewing, and the beginning of Third Eye the storm is building up more. Besides the whole agriculture aspect of the album, the storm is also a metaphor for war. Notice how the newer song, Tempest, sounds like a storm and describes a bigger war. There's a lot more intentional parallels between these two songs that will be in a later video. The electronic sounds you hear in Ions, Third Eye, and The Grudge are an auditory metaphor about social power and will come full circle in A Perfect Circle's 5th album, which will be about the discovery of alternating current. This all leads to the invention of television, which will happen in Tool's final 8th studio album, which will be about World War II and how television heavily influenced that war. Bill Hicks' speech about drugs is to further emphasize the early stages of humans experimenting to find cures, and how they began to travel far from their homes in search of medicines. This concept is continued in the following A Perfect Circle albums with songs such as Sleeping Beauty, like when he says, "I believe I could cure it all for you, dear." Another indicator of this is with song titles like The Patient, The Nurse Who Loved Me, and The Doctor Conversation in Lost Keys. That's all for now. There's plenty more to say about each song on this album, but we'll get to it in another video.